The Marigold Gala at the Westwood Grand was a celebration of wealth masquerading as charity. In rooms drenched with vintage champagne and conversations heavy with ambition, Nolan Carter stood exactly where he thought he belonged among the elite, where every handshake had a dollar sign attached. He swirled the golden liquid in his glass, letting the familiar burn of vintage scotch ground him. "Another win for Carter and Rowe," said his longtime business ally, Patrick Whitmore, his voice casual but eyes sharp. Nolan adjusted the cuffs of his midnight blue suit, custom made, of course. "Winning's what we do," he said with a half smile. "Losing doesn't fit the brand." At 34, Nolan had scaled every mountain Wall Street offered. The corner office with the skyline view, the Aston Martins in his private garage, the black Amaryllis jet, all his. He was known in headlines as Belmont's most eligible tycoon, but behind the accolades was a man so focused on building empires, he'd forgotten what it meant to build connection. Patrick tilted his head toward the entrance. "Looks like you've got company," he said. "Isn't that Grace Maddox?" Nolan's grip on his glass tightened. Grace Maddox, the only person who had ever made him feel small. A year ago, she had politely confidently turned down his offer to join Carter and Rowe. He'd been impressed by her white paper on ethical investment models. He offered her a lucrative deal, stock options, the works. She sent back a short reply. "I believe in business that does good, not just well." He'd kept the letter, framed it, mocked it, feared it. Now she was here, her green dress understated but elegant, pearl earrings the only accessory. While others sparkled, she simply stood out quietly, powerfully. "They say her firm beat yours last quarter," Patrick said, not noticing the tension flicker across Nolan's face. Nolan shrugged, trying to dismiss the sting. "Everyone gets lucky once." "She's not just lucky," Patrick replied, amused. "She's a Harvard grad who turned down Goldman, built her own investment firm before 30, and somehow made ethics sound profitable." He grinned. "Admit it, you admire her. If you like her so much, marry her." Nolan shot back, the words sharper than he intended. Patrick laughed, unfazed. "I would, if I could get a meeting with her first." As Patrick was pulled away into another conversation, Nolan remained still, eyes locked on Grace. She floated through the crowd like she had nothing to prove, because she didn't. Every person she spoke with, she looked at, as if they were the only one in the room. It bothered him, deeply. Because in all his years of networking, no one had ever made him feel so unseen. He finished his scotch in one determined gulp and walked towards her, steady and poised, not with the charm he used in boardrooms, but something more calculated. "Miss Maddox," he said, extending a hand. "Nolan Carter." "We've exchanged a few emails, if I recall." Grace turned slowly, her gaze measured, her handshake confident. "Mr. Carter?" she said, voice calm. "Yes, I remember. Your offer was generous. A beat. Just not aligned with where I want to go." He smiled, too practiced. "Perhaps you'll let me try again, in person this time." Her expression didn't waver. "I haven't changed direction, Mr. Carter. I still believe profit shouldn't come at the cost of people or the planet." Nolan leaned in slightly, his voice lower. "And I believe idealism makes great headlines, but poor balance sheets." She raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe we define success differently." Something about her tone, cool but not cold, left him off balance. For the first time in years, Nolan Carter felt like he was chasing, not leading. Grace tilted her head slightly, the corners of her mouth curving more out of politeness than interest. "Your offer was generous, Mr. Carter," she said evenly, "just not compelling." Nolan's smile was polished, rehearsed to the point of muscle memory. "Then perhaps we should talk about what it would take to bring someone with your talent into the Carter and Rowe family." There was a flicker in her eyes, something between amusement and irritation. I don't believe we speak the same investment language, she replied, cool but not cruel. You chase numbers. I chase impact. Nolan chuckled softly, but the sound was tinged with condescension. How noble. But in the real world, Grace? Doesn't profit still write the ending? Her answering smile was thin, barely reaching her eyes. That's where you and I differ. You ask what we earn. I ask what we leave behind. Nolan laughed a little too loud. Several heads turned. Leave behind? This isn't a TED Talk, he said, voice sharp with mockery. It's finance. Grace didn't flinch. And finance shapes the world, she answered calmly. Every dollar invested is a decision, a vote for the kind of future we believe in. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. This ethical investing fad, he murmured, it's smoke and mirrors. People say they care where their money goes until it hits their wallet. Grace's posture stiffened, her voice steady but steel-laced. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That wealth justifies the damage done? I don't have to justify making my clients rich, Nolan said, with a dismissive shrug. Results speak louder than ideals. They do, she agreed, stepping forward. So let's talk results. She paused just long enough for tension to build. Then coolly, your flagship fund posted an average 18.4% return over 3 years. Impressive. Nolan blinked. That wasn't public knowledge. My so-called amateur fund? She continued. 22.7%. While excluding fossil fuels, arms manufacturers, and companies with human rights violations. His face colored slightly. How the hell did she know that? And just in case you're wondering, she added, our client retention rate is 96%. Yours? 8%. Around them, the room had shifted. Conversations faded. People were listening. Nolan felt the pressure build in his chest. He needed to take control fast. Nice numbers, he said, forcing a casual tone. But the real test is time. Legacy. We've been in this business for 3 generations. Your project hasn't survived one market cycle. Grace smiled genuinely this time. You're right, Nolan. Longevity is the test. For companies and for the planet. And the way you do business, she let the silence linger. It's becoming obsolete. A ripple of murmurs passed through the nearby crowd. A few chuckled quietly. Nolan felt his facade begin to crack. You self-righteous idealist, he hissed under his breath. Your little green crusade might impress these champagne liberals, but in the real world is changing, Grace said, her voice rising above his, and you're standing on the wrong side of it. She turned to the growing circle of onlookers. Did you know Carter and Rowe increased its investment in TerraFuel Energy by 14% after their pipeline spill in Michigan? There was a stunned silence. Or that they're the primary backer of VisionGate, the surveillance tech company, supplying facial recognition to authoritarian governments. That's enough, Nolan growled, jaw clenched. I'm just warming up, she said smoothly. Shall we talk about your textile factory in Cambodia? Or the timber operation in Brazil? You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the fight had drained from his voice. Oh, but I do. She pulled out her phone. A screen lit up data, graphs, names, all public records. If you know where to look. From somewhere in the crowd, someone let out a low whistle. Another started a slow clap. Nolan Carter, once untouchable, stood in the middle of a ballroom, eyes burning, surrounded by whispers. And Grace Maddox? She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply stood her ground. I did my homework, Grace said softly, holding up her phone like a mirror he couldn't look away from, long before I turned you down. Somewhere in the crowd, a low whistle broke the silence, then slow clapping. It wasn't loud, just deliberate. And in that instant, Nolan Carter's world shifted, tilted just enough to feel unfamiliar beneath his feet. This wasn't happening. Not to him. Not here. In a room full of handshakes and headlines. His turf. Grace didn't gloat. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer. Almost sad. Your grandfather built something people respected, Nolan, but you've traded its legacy for quarterly returns. You call it strength. I call it loss. That last line was a knife, clean and precise. She had invoked the one man Nolan had spent his entire life trying to live up to Carter and Rowe's founder, his grandfather, his idol. Nolan barely managed a strained, "Excuse me," before he pushed past her, past the curious eyes and half-concealed smirks, and out into the open air of the terrace. The night was cold, but it didn't cool the fire crawling up his neck. He had just been publicly unraveled by a woman who embodied every value he dismissed as naive: responsibility, ethics, the world beyond shareholders. His phone buzzed in his jacket. "Mom, we need to talk. Grandfather's will, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Of course, because if the night hadn't collapsed enough, fate still had cards to play. The next morning, the Carter estate, Long Island. The Carter family estate was everything the Carter name stood for: tradition, power, and the kind of money that had old dust on it. Its rooms echoed with silence. Its halls smelled faintly of varnished wood and old pride. Margaret Carter sat like a statue at the head of the long oak dining table, straight-backed, precise, every inch the woman who raised a man like Nolan. "You're late," she said without turning her head, still wearing the same suit from last night and carrying a headache that no espresso could cure. Nolan slumped into the chair across from her. "Nice to see you too, Mom." He poured himself coffee, black and bitter. "Let's get this over with." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your grandfather has been gone for 6 months. Try to show some respect." "I respected him," Nolan muttered, just not his sense of timing. Passing away right before the Singapore deal closed? That's inconvenient. Margaret didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said everything. Before either could speak again, the heavy double doors creaked open. Walter Grant entered, the family's longtime attorney. He moved with the care of someone used to outliving the people he served. But his mind was still as sharp as a scalpel. "Nolan," he said, with a slight nod. "Margaret." "Walter?" Nolan replied warily. "What's this about? You dragging me here to read a ghost's goodbye letter?" "Not quite." Walter placed an old worn leather briefcase on the table. "By the terms of your grandfather's codicil." "His what?" Nolan interrupted. "An amendment to his will," Margaret supplied quietly. Her tone had shifted, almost hesitant now. "It was meant to be read exactly 6 months after his passing." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "And you're only telling me now because that was his request," Walter said simply. He opened the briefcase and withdrew a document. Thick parchment, sealed with the family crest. Nolan's hand froze mid-sip. "Your grandfather made provisions," Margaret said, "about Carter and Rowe, about your inheritance." "My inheritance is secure," Nolan scoffed. "I'm the only male heir. We've been over this." Walter's expression didn't change. But the silence that followed had weight. "Your grandfather amended the terms 3 years ago," the lawyer continued, "after his 89th birthday. He felt given the direction of the company, certain conditions were necessary for you to maintain control." Nolan's confidence began to wobble, almost imperceptibly. "What kind of conditions?" Walter slid the document across the table, tapping the seal with one weathered finger. "You'll want to sit down for this." Nolan already was, but he felt like standing would be safer. "Marriage?" Nolan's voice cracked, disbelief sharpening every syllable. "That's the condition?" Walter Grant gave a measured nod, adjusting his glasses as if this were any other legal matter, not a bomb detonated over Nolan's future. Within 1 year of this document's reading, he confirmed, that's the primary condition to retain full control of Carter and Rowe and your inheritance. Nolan's coffee cup slipped from his hand, hitting the table with a thud. The dark liquid spilled across the white linen like a spreading bruise. Neither Walter nor Margaret moved to clean it. You're serious? Nolan asked, stunned. This is ridiculous, outdated, insane. Your grandfather believed marriage would offer you something you've lacked, Margaret said, her voice quiet but unwavering. Stability, perspective. A reason to care about more than quarterly returns. It's 225, not the 19th century, Nolan snapped, standing abruptly. He began pacing the room. You're telling me he's controlling my personal life from the grave? Yes, Walter replied evenly. Legally, he can. Conditional inheritances are well within the bounds of the law. Then I'll contest it. You could, Walter allowed, but the legal battle would outlast the 1-year deadline, and during that time, the company would pass into the hands of the Board of Trustees. Nolan froze. The board, a collection of aging executives and cautious investors who still measured success by dividends, not vision. They'd run the company into the ground, he said. Which is exactly why your grandfather believed you'd choose the alternative, Walter said with a flicker of a smile. This isn't strategy, Nolan growled. This is blackmail. No, Margaret corrected. It's legacy. The one you've never fully honored. Nolan rounded on her, pain flashing behind his anger. And you agreed to this? Your own son being manipulated like this? I agreed, she said gently, because I want you to become more than the man you've settled for being. He laughed bitterly. So I find some opportunist, slap a ring on her finger, play house for a year, secure my fortune, then get a quiet divorce? Walter cleared his throat. Actually, there's more. Nolan narrowed his eyes. Of course there is. The marriage, Walter continued, must last a minimum of 3 years. You must live together in the same household for the duration. 3 years? Nolan practically shouted. With a stranger? Not necessarily a stranger, Margaret said, almost too calmly. Her tone made Nolan pause. What aren't you telling me? A heavy silence followed. Margaret and Walter exchanged a look. Finally, Walter spoke. The amendment also stipulates a long-standing agreement between the Carter and Maddox families. Your grandfather and James Maddox, Grace's grandfather, were close friends and business partners for decades. Nolan's stomach dropped. He didn't want to believe what he was hearing. The Maddox family? He asked, already knowing the answer. You mean Grace Maddox? Margaret gave a small, solemn nod. Yes. Nolan sat back down, as if the air had been punched out of him. Grace Maddox, he whispered. The same woman who humiliated me in front of half the financial elite last night? That Grace Maddox? Walter nodded. The very one. For years, Margaret explained, your grandfather and James hoped their families would one day be united again, in business and in purpose. This was their vision. This is a nightmare, Nolan muttered. She despises me, and the feeling's mutual. Regardless, Walter said, unshaken, if you choose not to proceed with this arrangement, control of Carter and Rowe immediately passes to the board, and your personal inheritance will be redirected. To where? A foundation, Walter replied, one dedicated to environmental justice and corporate accountability. Nolan laughed darkly. You're telling me that if I don't marry Grace Maddox, I get to fund everything she believes in against my will? Your grandfather was a sharp man, Walter said, his voice quiet. He planned for every outcome, even your resistance. She knows? Nolan asked, his voice tight with disbelief. Grace already knows about this? Margaret nodded. Her parents are telling her today, and if she refuses? Walter folded his hands. Then the Maddox family will follow their own path. I understand her grandfather's will contains similar language. Nolan rose again, this time slower. He crossed the room and stared out the towering windows at the sculpted garden below, perfect hedges, pristine roses, a symbol of order and inheritance. Every Everything he'd ever known, everything that could now be stripped away, not by scandal or failure, but by a dead man's idea of destiny. So let me get this straight, he said, not turning around. I'm supposed to propose to the woman who humiliated me in front of a ballroom full of people, a woman who rejects everything I've built. Or, Margaret said softly, she represents everything you've forgotten. Nolan turned sharply, the words cutting deeper than he expected. Spare me the fortune cookie wisdom, mother. This is my life, my company. Walter's voice cut in, calm but firm. Your grandfather's company, Mr. Carter. He built it from nothing. He earned the right to shape its future. I've tripled our returns in 5 years. At what cost? Margaret asked gently. The Carter name used to mean something beyond numbers. Your grandfather saw that slipping, one compromise at a time. Nolan felt cornered by ghosts, expectations, and the looming threat of losing everything he'd spent his adult life clawing toward. Walter spoke again, almost as an afterthought. Grace Maddox isn't just a name. She manages a substantial portion of her family's holdings, in addition to running her own investment firm. If hypothetically, you two could stop fighting long enough to cooperate, the combined force of Carter and Maddox would be formidable. Nolan let out a dry laugh. If we don't kill each other first. Think of it, Walter said mildly, as a merger with personal terms. Or, Margaret added, her voice barely above a whisper, as a chance to become the man your grandfather believed you could be. Nolan turned back to the window. The garden looked different now, less like a symbol of security, more like a cage. Finally, he exhaled and turned toward Walter. I want to see it. The codicil. Every word, every clause, every potential loophole. Walter didn't blink. He simply slid the stack of documents across the table. Of course. Nolan began reading, scanning the legal language with sharp eyes. His phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. The message was brief. I assume you've heard the absurd news. Meet me at 2 p.m. Westbridge Cafe. We need to talk. Grace Maddox. He stared at the screen, a dozen emotions twisted in his chest. Anger, curiosity, and something he couldn't name. His life had always been clean lines and mapped strategy. Harvard, Carter and Rowe, acquisitions, growth. Now everything was unraveling, tied to a woman who had made him a punchline. I have a meeting, he announced abruptly, grabbing his coat. With who? Margaret asked, startled. Nolan paused at the door. My fiancé. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. Margaret's eyes widened with a glimmer of something hope. Relief? You're considering it, she asked. I'm considering all my options, Nolan said coldly, including how to get out of this medieval circus. As he pushed through the front doors, Walter called after him. The clock is ticking, Mr. Carter. 12 months, starting today. Nolan leaned against the side of his Aston Martin, the crisp fall air cooling the fire in his chest. He was a man known for control, for never flinching, never folding. But this? 1 year, one woman, one impossible choice. For the first time in his life, Nolan Carter had no idea how to win. But one thing was certain, he wasn't about to lose quietly. And if Grace Maddox thought their public clash was war, she hadn't seen anything yet. He glanced up at the cafe's sign. No marble floors, no gold-trimmed menus, just a modest brick building on a quiet street, neutral territory. Not Wall Street, not a tree-hugger's haven, just a space where two people could speak without eyes on them. Nolan checked his watch. He was 15 minutes early. He always was. Nolan chose a table tucked into the far corner of the cafe, his back to the wall, old habit. He ordered an espresso and rehearsed lines in his head. Assertive, but not arrogant. Controlled, but not cold. He needed to own this conversation, frame it on his terms. All that mental preparation vanished the moment Grace walked through the door. She was exactly on time. Of course she was. Gone was the emerald gown and polished updo. Today she wore dark jeans, a crisp white shirt, and a navy blazer. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, relaxed, confident, quietly disarming. She looked younger, more real, and, infuriatingly, even more beautiful. Nolan stood, an automatic response his mother had ingrained in him since childhood. "Mr. Carter," Grace said coolly as she slid into the seat across from him. "I think, given the circumstances, you can call me Nolan," he replied, trying to sound unbothered. "The circumstances being our upcoming nuptials?" Her voice was dry enough to cut glass. "Let's call it what it is, corporate blackmail in a silk ribbon." "So," he said, forcing a smile, "we're starting off on a high note." Grace motioned to the waiter and ordered a black tea. "No sugar." A single nod. Efficient. Like everything else about her. "I take it you were as blindsided by this as I was?" she asked once the waiter stepped away. "Completely," Nolan said. "And I'm guessing you're not thrilled." Grace laughed a short, unexpected sound, surprisingly genuine. "Being forced to marry the poster boy for everything I've spent my career pushing against? No, I wouldn't say thrilled," he smirked. "The feeling's mutual." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Let's talk options. There has to be a way out of this medieval mess." The tea arrived, interrupting their tension for a moment. Grace added a touch of milk, stirred it exactly 3 times, and set her spoon down with surgical precision. "I've already consulted 3 lawyers," she said calmly. "The will is airtight, ironclad. My grandfather didn't leave any exits." "Mine either," Nolan admitted, rubbing a hand down his face. "But there's always a loophole. A back door." Grace shook her head. "There isn't. If I refuse, I lose controlling interest in Maddox equity, and my ethical fund gets absorbed by my uncle's tech conglomerate. And if I refuse," Nolan added, "Carter and Rowe gets handed to a board of financial dinosaurs." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation finally settling between them. "Why would they do this to us?" Nolan asked, almost to himself. Grace stared at her tea. "According to my mother, our grandfathers were once best friends, but they split over values. Mine walked away from a deal involving weapons manufacturing. Yours didn't." "I know," Nolan said quietly. "I found a memo about it in the archives." "They never reconciled professionally," Grace said, "but personally, they stayed close. And this," she gestured between them, "this is their final joke. Or hope. For balance. Legacy." Nolan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Balance? You and me? Your ruthless capitalism," she said, twirling her spoon slowly, "balanced by my inconvenient ethics. My business instincts balanced by your idealism," he replied. They looked at each other across the table, both unflinching, both unwilling to blink. "This is ridiculous," Grace finally muttered. "We're adults. It's 2025. We can't seriously go through with an arranged marriage. Unless you've got $3 million to buy yourself out," Nolan said. "Do you have 880? She countered. They had reached the only truth that mattered. They were trapped. "So," Nolan said slowly, "we get married. We live together. We endure this for 3 years. Then we go our separate ways. Unless," Grace replied softly, "we find another solution in the meantime." Nolan leaned back. "A marriage of convenience? People have done it for less," she said. "True," Nolan said, jaw tightening. though most of those arrangements don't start with one party destroying the other's reputation in front of the entire financial industry. Grace met his eyes without flinching. I don't regret speaking the truth, she said. About what happened at the gala, Nolan started, but Grace cut him off, calm but unwavering. I won't apologize, she said. Every word I said was backed by facts. But yes, timing it the way I did, that part was intentional. There was no regret in her voice, only resolve. Nolan didn't argue. She hadn't denied it. He respected that, even as it burned. I believe in accountability, she added. And in playing fair, his eyes narrowed slightly. Your definition of fair includes calling out my company in public? Your company, she said, voice cool, has been cited for union suppression in 3 countries and fined over $40 million for environmental violations just last year. Nolan leaned in, his tone low and firm. Carter and Rowe employs over 170,000 people around the world. We provide security, stability, and consistent returns for clients who rely on us for their retirement and future. The world isn't black and white, Grace. She arched a brow. If we're about to be married, you might as well use my first name. Fair enough, Nolan muttered, before continuing. You're calling me morally bankrupt, but you're missing the nuances. Maybe, Grace replied, but some things shouldn't be that complicated. Silence stretched between them, the cafe around them, humming with normalcy coffee orders, keyboard clicks, quiet laughter. Life went on, as if theirs weren't about to be turned inside out. 3 years, Nolan finally said. If we're doing this, we need rules. Ground rules. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Of course she had one. Nolan fought the urge to roll his eyes. Rule 1, she began, professional and precise. Our work stays separate. You don't interfere with my investment strategies, and I don't interfere with yours. Agreed, Nolan said. With one exception, during the 3 years, Carter and Rowe will consult with your team before entering any new industries. Consult, not seek approval. Grace looked up, surprised by the concession. Acceptable. Rule 2, she continued, separate residences, but one shared address for appearance's sake. My penthouse is under renovation, Nolan replied quickly, and it's only got 1 bedroom. How convenient, Grace murmured dryly. Mine's no better. We'll need neutral ground. I have a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, Nolan offered. 4 bedrooms, recently renovated. Was supposed to be a rental, but it's vacant. She nodded. That could work. Rule 3, she said, her tone sharper. This arrangement is strictly professional. No romantic entanglements. Nolan smirked. Trust me. I prefer my partners with less self-righteousness. And I prefer mine with a soul, Grace shot back. Another standoff. They were stacking those up like poker chips. Rule 4, she continued. We maintain a convincing public image. No one finds out this marriage is contractual. If they do, we lose everything. Agreed, Nolan said. Which means you stop slamming my company in public. I'll stop criticizing you in public, she clarified. But I won't fake support for business practices I find unethical. He considered this. Fine. But if you have an issue, bring it to me first. Grace nodded. Rule 5. After 3 years, we separate. Amicably. Irreconcilable differences. But we remain business-friendly. If we haven't killed each other by then, Nolan added. Grace offered a faint smile. A risk I'm willing to take. Nolan leaned back in his chair, studying the woman who would soon wear his name at least on paper. She was brilliant, tireless, infuriating, and maybe the first person in years who had made him feel challenged. I have one condition of my own, he said. She glanced up, wary. Complete honesty, he said quietly. No secret plays, no hidden agendas. If we're going to be partners, even fake ones, I need to trust you. Grace blinked. For the first time in their conversation, she looked slightly taken aback. Honesty, she repeated, almost to herself. Coming from the man whose company operates through a maze of offshore accounts and shell firms, business strategy and personal integrity aren't always the same thing, Nolan replied. Aren't they? She asked, eyes searching his. Maybe that's the difference between you and me. I can't separate them. He didn't answer right away, because he wasn't sure she was wrong. Are we doing this or not? Nolan asked, trying to mask the sting of her earlier jab. Grace didn't answer right away. She studied him for a moment that felt longer than it should have, her gaze unreadable, steady, weighing something he couldn't name. One last condition, she said finally. For the duration of this arrangement, I want access to Carter and Rowe's operational data. Nolan blinked. To interfere? To understand, she replied smoothly. Call it due diligence, or knowing one's enemy, or in this case, one's reluctant partner. He couldn't help it. He admired her strategy, even if it unnerved him. Only if I get the same access to Maddox equity, he said. Your fund, your operations, done. They regarded each other like chess players, each waiting for the other to make a wrong move. Two unwilling pieces, nudged forward by grandfathers long gone, but still pulling the strings. So, Nolan said, breaking the silence, how exactly do we announce an engagement that started with a public takedown? With a convincing story, Grace replied, which is why I've arranged for us to be seen tonight. Dinner at the Ashford. Romantic, popular, very visible. You've been busy. I'm efficient, she said, gathering her bag. Pick me up at 7. Don't wear anything that screams hostile takeover. And bring flowers. Let me guess, he said dryly. Peonies, not roses. Too cliché, peonies in deep crimson, like the lipstick I wore the night I dismantled your ego. She was halfway out the door before turning back. Oh, and Nolan? Make sure the ring is ethically sourced. No blood diamonds. This is a marriage of convenience, not corruption. With that, she walked out, leaving him sitting in silence with a now cold espresso and the sinking feeling he'd just negotiated the most emotionally complex deal of his career. Later that afternoon, he opened the Carter family vault and selected a vintage emerald-cut diamond ring flanked by 2 deep green stones, ethically sourced, long before anyone asked such questions. He chose it not just because it fit the story, but because he'd noticed the way she'd looked in that green dress. The thought came unbidden, and he quickly shoved it aside. This was a contract, not a connection, a performance, not a partnership, and yet, he'd already ordered the peonies. Nolan stood at her doorstep, flowers in hand, nerves buried beneath a practiced exterior. He was about to pretend to be in love with the woman who had publicly embarrassed him less than 48 hours earlier. This is the strangest deal I've ever made, he muttered, pressing the buzzer. Grace opened the door, and Nolan momentarily forgot the script. She wore a simple black dress that managed to be both elegant and quietly devastating. Her hair was loose, soft waves falling around her shoulders. For a second, he just stared. You're punctual, she said, accepting the bouquet. And you remembered the peonies. I take contract terms seriously, Nolan replied, regaining composure. Even floral clauses. She disappeared for a moment to place the flowers in water. When she returned, her expression had softened, just slightly. They're beautiful. Thank you. An awkward silence settled between them. They were business rivals, yet here they were, about to play a couple in love. You look, Nolan began, then hesitated, choosing his words like weapons. Appropriate. Grace raised an eyebrow. Were you aiming for charming? I was going for accurate, he said, lips twitching. But even he wasn't sure if he meant the compliment or the cover. Tui te vi e d e ela b n v l huan tuang va 9 Vi phong kết ngon t m so s c và ting ti chỉ nguyên idis sungwaje sin in te hai en si da mi skanya yang inya meng di u en si a shining stories. Nolan paused, searching for a word that didn't sound like a quarterly report or, worse, an inappropriate advance. Presentable? Grace offered dryly, one brow arched. I was going to say lovely, Nolan admitted, adjusting his cuff. But I wasn't sure if compliments violated the terms of our contract. They're practically mandatory, Grace replied, slipping into her coat. No one's going to believe you proposed to someone you didn't find attractive. He moved to help her, a reflex, not an act. For a moment, they stood closer than usual, just long enough for him to catch the soft scent of her perfumed jasmine and something warm like vanilla. Not at all the sharp, commanding scent he had expected. It disarmed him. The reservation's for 8, she said, breaking the silence. But we should arrive early. Visibility matters. Agreed. Nolan nodded. I mentioned it to Patrick Whitmore yesterday. He'll be there with his wife. The Blakely Thompsons, too. Grace looked over, mildly impressed. Strategic, I try, he said. I may have dropped a note to Dana Wallace at Bloomberg, she added, reaching for her clutch, just in case she wants to cover the city's latest power couple. Nolan exhaled a small laugh. So we're both committed to the charade. 3 years of autonomy is worth 1 night of theater. He'd chosen the Tesla tonight, sleek, silent, understated, less spectacle, more purpose. He knew she'd notice. They ran the story one last time. We met as kids, Nolan recited. Charity fundraiser. Our grandfathers were close. Reconnected 6 months ago, Grace continued. At the Sustainable Investment Summit in Boston, I saw your presentation, and you realized I wasn't the heartless capitalist you assumed. She turned to him, a glint in her eye. Don't get ahead of yourself. I said I was impressed, not converted. Careful, he said, glancing at her. That almost sounded genuine. I'm a better actress than you give me credit for, she replied with a smile that gave nothing away. And the proposal? Last weekend, Nolan said. Dinner on the balcony at Berker's, under the moonlight. Intimate. Intentional. She nodded. Believable. Romantic, without being showy. And the ring. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. He opened it slowly. Inside, a vintage platinum ring with an emerald-cut diamond, flanked by 2 deep green emeralds. Understated and striking like her. Grace's expression shifted. For a moment, her walls dropped. It's beautiful. Ethically sourced, Nolan added, almost wryly. Long before that became a buzzword. My grandmother's. Circa 1925, the emeralds, she murmured, like the dress I wore at the gala. You noticed that? She asked, surprised. Some things stand out. She took the ring and slipped it on. Fits better than expected. I had it resized, Nolan admitted. She looked at him, but didn't comment. As the car pulled up to the entrance, Nolan straightened his jacket. Now for the hard part. Pretending we're madly in love? Grace asked. Exactly. She slipped her hand into his. I've negotiated billion-dollar deals with hostile regimes. This will be easy. Your confidence is overwhelming, Nolan said as he opened the door for her. He placed his hand gently at the small of her back, as she stepped out a subtle gesture that felt too natural. To his surprise, Grace didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned into it just enough. Cameras clicked. Word had spread fast. Showtime, Nolan muttered. Grace's fingers tightened around his. For a moment, they looked exactly like the story they were selling. The maitre d' welcomed them with the kind of discreet enthusiasm reserved for power couples and regulars with headlines attached to their names. Mr. Carter, Ms. Maddox. Your table is ready, he announced, just loudly enough for the message to ripple across nearby diners. Nolan caught the shifting gazes, the whispered exchanges. He spotted at least 3 financial reporters, Patrick Whitmore in the corner with his wife, and 2 board members from Carter and Rowe seated near the bar. Perfect. He pulled Grace's chair out for her, letting his hands brush briefly across her shoulders, long enough to register, short enough not to feel rehearsed. She glanced up, offering a smile so natural it startled him. "You're good at this," he murmured as he sat across from her. "So are you," she replied sweetly, her voice just loud enough to sound intimate to surrounding tables. "The champagne will give us away," Nolan said with a smirk. "Every finance guy here is ordering Dom Perignon." Predictable. "Then what would you suggest, darling?" Grace asked, leaning into the role with practiced grace. "Surprise me," she added. When the sommelier arrived, Nolan didn't hesitate. "The Barthélemy Salon Rosé, please." Grace's eyes flickered only slightly, but enough for him to notice. "I take it I chose well?" "It's my favorite," she admitted, then added with a tilt of her head. "Lucky guess?" "Or thorough research," he replied smoothly. "I do admire diligence," she said, her smile flickering with amusement. As the champagne was poured, Patrick Whitmore left his table, curiosity outweighing politeness. "Nolan." "Grace," he said, greeting them with mild surprise. Quite the pairing. Nolan stood to shake his hand. "Patrick, good to see you." Patrick's gaze lingered on Grace's left hand as she casually reached for her glass, the vintage emerald ring catching the light like a whispered secret. "Is that—" he began, eyes widening. "We hadn't planned to announce it just yet," Nolan said, reaching across the table to take Grace's hand. "But yes, we're engaged." Patrick blinked. "Engaged?" "After the way things played out at the gala, I thought you two were sworn enemies, not soulmates." Grace laughed. A light, melodic sound Nolan hadn't heard before. "Well, passion wears many disguises, Patrick. Sometimes the space between disagreement and connection is narrower than you think." "It was the most mentally stimulating argument I've had in years," Nolan added, picking up the rhythm easily. "Why wouldn't I want a lifetime of that?" Patrick looked between them, struggling to reconcile the image with what he'd seen just days before. "Well, congratulations. I guess I missed something. How long has this been happening?" "We've known each other since we were kids," Grace said smoothly, "but we reconnected 6 months ago." "More seriously, she's kept me honest," Nolan added, challenging how I see business, how I see everything. "And he's reminded me that behind the relentless ambition," Grace said, her voice softening, "there's a man capable of reflection, and maybe even change." For a moment, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Too long to be rehearsed, too sincere to be staged. Patrick cleared his throat. "Well, the Reed-Maddox alliance is going to rock Wall Street. It's like Goldman Sachs marrying Greenpeace." Nolan smiled. "The best partnerships bring complementary strengths, don't they?" "Absolutely," Grace agreed, "though I did negotiate certain environmental stipulations in advance. Even in love, she negotiates like a corporate strategist," Nolan teased. And Grace laughed genuinely. It surprised him. It surprised her too. "I'll leave you two to your romantic evening," Patrick said with a grin, retreating toward his table. "But fair warning, my wife is already texting half of Manhattan." As he walked away, Nolan leaned across the table, lowering his voice. "Environmental impact assessments?" he murmured. "Not part of our agreement. Improvisation keeps the illusion alive," Grace replied, unfazed. "Besides, it's what I'd request if this were real." "In the heart beneath my ruthless exterior line?" he challenged. "Artistic license," she shrugged, taking another delicate sip of her champagne. "Though to your credit, you did choose my favorite bottle." "Points for research or intuition," Nolan offered a wry smile. Let's call it both. The rest of the evening unfolded with a surreal fluidity, interrupted occasionally by familiar faces from the financial world, each more stunned than the last to see these two supposed adversaries seated together, exchanging laughter and champagne toasts like long-lost lovers. But what began as performance began, slowly, to morph. Over plates of seared scallops and dry-aged steak, the conversation drifted beyond rehearsed lines and into real moments. Childhood memories, university experiences, their favorite books, the films they rewatched when the world became too much. Nolan found himself caught off guard by Grace's dry wit and her unabashed love for classic noir cinema. She, in turn, seemed genuinely surprised by his quiet knowledge of Renaissance art and his long-standing hobby, restoring vintage motorcycles in a private garage he rarely mentioned. "You're not quite who I thought you were," Grace said, swirling the last of her champagne. "Disappointed?" Nolan asked, the edge of a grin playing at his lips. "Confused," she corrected. "A man who discusses Kurosawa films over ethically sourced champagne doesn't quite match the executive who approved that palm oil development in Malaysia." His smile faded for a beat. "Business and personal life are separate realms, should they be?" she asked, softly echoing the question she had posed hours earlier. Before he could answer, the sommelier returned this time with a flourish, a warm, dark chocolate soufflé, artfully plated with 2 spoons. "Compliments of Chef Laurent," he said, to celebrate the newly engaged. Word had traveled faster than either of them anticipated. As they leaned in to share the dessert, a camera clicked discreetly from across the room. A society photographer from a major lifestyle publication already capturing the headline image: Nolan Carter and Grace Maddox, rivals turned lovers share, dessert at the Ashford. "We're officially a spectacle," Nolan muttered. "That was the assignment," Grace replied, her tone unreadable. The air was cool, brushed with the first breath of autumn. Grace shivered, just barely. Without hesitation, Nolan shrugged off his jacket and placed it around her shoulders. "That wasn't for the crowd," she said quietly, surprised. "No one's watching," he said. "Old habit. My mother would never forgive me if I let a woman freeze on the sidewalk, even one who thinks I'm single-handedly killing the planet." Grace smiled faintly. "Then she raised you well, even if your moral compass needs recalibrating." They stood in silence, closer than strictly necessary. No paparazzi, no business associates, no need to pretend. Just 2 people in the soft haze of restaurant lights and champagne afterglow, surrounded by a quiet that somehow made everything feel more real. "Do you think they believed us?" Grace asked, her voice unusually tentative. "Yes," Nolan answered without hesitation. "We were convincing. How can you be so sure?" He turned to her. "Because, for a few moments in there, I almost believed it myself." The honesty hung between them, startling in its simplicity, and for the first time, neither of them knew who was acting anymore. For a heartbeat, Grace's expression was unreadable. But something passed between them, not attraction exactly, but a flicker of understanding, recognition, a silent acknowledgement of shared vulnerability in this impossible arrangement. Then the valet pulled up, and the moment dissolved like mist. Nolan opened the car door. Grace paused briefly before stepping in. "Thank you for dinner," she said formally. "It wasn't what I expected." "A compliment from Grace Maddox?" Nolan teased with a crooked smile. "Should I frame the date?" "Don't get used to it," she replied, but her voice lacked its usual sharpness. The ride back to her apartment unfolded in a quiet, almost comfortable silence. The night had achieved everything it was supposed to. Their engagement was now public knowledge, whispered about over dessert, and blogged about before midnight. Mission accomplished. Yet, when Nolan walked her to her door, another unnecessary but instinctive gesture, he felt oddly reluctant to leave. "So," he said, slightly awkward, Same time next week? For our next public showing? Grace nodded, businesslike. I'll have my assistant coordinate with yours. We should also map out the wedding timeline. A long engagement would look suspicious. Nolan nodded. Agreed. She hesitated at the door, then added, more softly, for what it's worth. You played the doting fiancé convincingly. It was almost, she paused, almost enjoyable, pretending. With you. High praise, Nolan said with a smile that reached further than usual. Good night, Grace. Good night, Nolan. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. Your jacket. Keep it, he said over his shoulder. It's cold tonight. Downstairs, in the elevator, Nolan caught his reflection in the mirror, shirt sleeves slightly rumpled, the faint trace of a smile on his lips. For a man in the middle of the most complicated business transaction of his life, he looked, suspiciously, content. Upstairs, in her apartment, Grace placed the crimson peonies in a more prominent position on her coffee table, then realized what she was doing. With a frown, she kicked off her heels and crossed to the window. She watched the taillights of Nolan's Tesla disappear down the quiet street. She was still wearing his jacket. It smelled like his cologne and something else she couldn't quite name. Something warm, familiar, not entirely unpleasant. It's just business, she told her reflection in the glass. But her fingers were absently turning the emerald ring on her hand, the ring she'd forgotten to return. For a woman who built a career on clear-eyed judgment, Grace Maddox couldn't quite convince herself that everything about this arrangement was still business. What had begun as a neutral investment property had slowly, quietly become something else. Not quite a home, but dangerously close. And what had started as a choreographed cohabitation now resembled something like rhythm, a shared life, informal, undeniably real. On this Sunday morning, Nolan stood in the kitchen, French press in one hand, watching Grace curled up on the window seat of the breakfast nook. She wore reading glasses, a detail he hadn't known until they lived under the same roof, and she was deep in quarterly reports from Carter and Rowe. Find anything damning? He asked, setting a mug of tea beside her. She glanced up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Just confirming my suspicion that your Asia-Pacific division is outperforming expectations. I'm still debating whether it's brilliant management or creative accounting. Can it be both? Nolan grinned, settling into the chair across from her. 6 months of marriage on paper had worn away the sharper edges between them. What had once been barbed remarks now felt like banter. The lines had blurred. The wedding had been small, elegant, and calculated, held at the Carter estate under a sky the color of late summer pearls. It was intimate enough to suggest romance, but public enough to fulfill the stipulations buried in both their grandfathers' wills. Since then, life had settled into a rhythm odd, often tense, occasionally easy. A quiet choreography of shared space and sidelong glances. Professional rivalry by day, shared dinners, and hesitant laughter by night. I've been meaning to ask, Grace said, removing her reading glasses and setting down a file. The timber project in Oregon. You paused expansion? Nolan shrugged, as if it were a footnote. Environmental assessment came back with red flags. We're reevaluating. What he didn't mention was the 3 sleepless nights he'd spent poring over data after finding her notes on sustainable forestry practices, left deliberately on the kitchen counter, pages annotated in her neat, decisive handwriting. Grace murmured, masking her surprise. And the new green bond launch? Smart business, he said. Sustainable investment is rising. We'd be stupid to ignore the shift, Grace arched a brow. Interesting how your definition of smart business keeps evolving. The world changes, Nolan replied simply. You adapt, or you get left behind. He didn't add that her impassioned dinner arguments had reshaped how he measured risk, or that her ethical frameworks had slowly made their way into his quarterly strategies. Speaking of adapting, he said, deliberately shifting the subject, my mother called. She wants us over for Sunday dinner. Again, Grace groaned. That's the third invitation this month. She's getting suspicious. Of what? Nolan asked, playing innocent. Our thoroughly believable, flawlessly constructed marriage? She thinks it's too believable, Grace said, holding his gaze. Last time she cornered me and asked if it had become real. Nolan blinked. What did you say? I told her the truth, Grace replied, that this is a mutually beneficial partnership with an expiration date. And she believed you? No, Grace laughed, quietly. She said we look at each other differently now. A silence settled between them, not tense, just uncertain. Neither of them wanted to name what that difference might be. We're just good actors, Nolan said at last. Very good, Grace echoed quickly. Even Patrick Whitmore, commented last week, said we seemed perfectly matched. Well, Nolan said, standing abruptly, we've had lots of practice. I thought you were off today, Grace asked, frowning slightly as he reached for his tablet. Board meeting prep. You know, the job. Some of us still work weekends, she teased. Some of us work smarter, not harder, he shot back, slipping back into their usual banter, the safe, familiar kind. But when he reached the stairs, Nolan paused and glanced back. Grace had already returned to her reading, but a small smile lingered on her lips. Not the one she wore at galas or press conferences, the real one, the one he'd learned to recognize in the quiet. Something had shifted, slowly, quietly, like tectonic plates beneath the surface, subtle but unstoppable. What had begun as an uneasy truce had become mutual respect, then reluctant camaraderie, and now something neither of them had the words for. They still debated fiercely, but the edge had softened. The intention had changed. Upstairs, in his office, Nolan sat at his desk. The quarterly projection open but forgotten. His thoughts wandered. To the sound of Grace laughing in the kitchen. To the look on her mother's face. To the question he didn't want to ask. Do we really look at each other differently now? And worse, was it no longer just an act? Love, as they'd crafted it, had always been for public consumption. Something curated, rehearsed. A script they both knew by heart. But lately the lines had started to blur. Nolan found himself looking forward to their nightly debates over ethics and enterprise, to the way Grace's eyes sparked when she was proving a point, to the rare but golden moments when she laughed without restraint. It's just proximity, he muttered to himself, leaning back in his chair. Familiarity, nothing more. A soft knock on the study door interrupted the lie. Grace stood there, car keys in hand. I'm heading to the farmer's market, she said. Need anything? It was such a simple question. So ordinary, so jarringly real, he hesitated. Then, actually wait, I'll come with you. Grace raised an eyebrow. You? At a farmer's market? You once called it a hipster's paradise for overpriced vegetables. Your words, not mine. I could use some fresh air, Nolan shrugged. And someone needs to stop you from spending half our budget on lavender honey again. Grace smiled. That honey was exceptional, and you know it. They walked side by side, weaving through rows of organic produce, homemade jams, and rustic cheeses. To maintain their cover, Nolan's arm rested casually around Grace's shoulders, an easy, practiced intimacy. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, called a cheerful voice. The honey stand. An elderly woman waved enthusiastically. We've got that lavender blend your husband loves. Nolan felt Grace freeze slightly beside him. You've been here before? She whispered. Once or twice, he admitted. The honey's actually really good. Grace stared at him like he'd just revealed a secret alter ego. You come here. On purpose. Without me? Don't make it a thing, he muttered, gently steering her toward the booth. As they continued through the stalls, more vendors greeted them by name. Grace kept casting him curious glances. This wasn't in the contract. Their carefully crafted arrangement hadn't accounted for this. Nolan remembering the name of the cheesemaker's daughter, or knowing which vendor sold the best Saitama heirloom tomatoes in the borough. You're full of surprises today, she said as they walked home, arms filled with produce and, yes, the infamous lavender honey. People change, Nolan replied. Do they? Grace asked, her voice soft. Her words felt heavier than their simplicity suggested. Back at the brownstone, they moved around the kitchen in quiet sync. Nolan unpacked groceries while Grace started lunch. It was a rhythm, now an unspoken choreography refined over months of sharing space and life. As they sat down to eat, Nolan broke the silence. I've been thinking, he said. Grace glanced up from her salad. About Meridian Oil. Her fork stopped midair. Meridian Oil, the company she had once publicly condemned him for investing in the night that had changed everything. What about it? She asked carefully. You were right, he said, and the words didn't come easily. The environmental risks outweigh the potential gains. I'm pulling Carter and Rowe out. She stared at him, stunned. That's a $100 million position. 120, actually, Nolan corrected, meeting her eyes. But sometimes there are things more important than profit. The words landed between them like a stone in still water. Grace lowered her gaze, her fingers brushing the edge of her plate. Well, she said, after a beat, that's good business. Is it? Nolan asked quietly. Or is it something else? Before she could answer, his phone buzzed, cutting through the moment like a knife. The custom ringtone. The call was from his mother. Nolan excused himself, stepping out of the room. Grace remained at the table, staring at her untouched salad, alone with a thought she'd spent months avoiding. The truth was uncomfortable. Somewhere between staged interviews and whispered strategy, between passionate disagreements over policy and peaceful Sunday mornings, filled with coffee and quiet, the boundaries had dissolved. She had started to see Nolan Carter, not as the ruthless corporate raider she once detested, but as a man, a complicated, flawed, stubborn man, who was also trying subtly, carefully to be better. He still made her grind her teeth with his arrogance and his occasional cluelessness, but she no longer saw those traits as all of him, just fragments of a larger, evolving whole. And now he was divesting from Meridian Oil, the very company she'd used to publicly tear him down. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was something more powerful, a quiet shift in values, intentional, strategic, real. She hadn't expected that. Nolan returned, his expression unreadable. That was my mother, he said. The board's calling an emergency meeting tomorrow. Grace sat up straighter. What happened? Blackstone Partners, Nolan said grimly. They've been buying up shares for months. They're pushing for a hostile takeover. If I don't agree, they'll break the company apart. But you have controlling interest, Grace said, confused, through the inheritance, which, Nolan reminded her, only remains valid if our marriage lasts 3 full years. If there's any suspicion that this is all for show, the shares revert to the board, and some of them are already entertaining Blackstone's offer. Grace's mind raced. Are you saying someone's investigating us? Yes, Blackstone's CEO has hired private investigators. They've already planted doubt with a few board members. Nothing concrete yet, but it doesn't take much. Just uncertainty. She processed this in silence. Then she straightened. Then we do what we do best, she said. We make it real. Public appearances, interviews, shared statements. Whatever it takes to sell this story. Nolan shook his head. It's not just about public appearances anymore. They'll be watching everything, every look, every touch. One wrong move, and it's over. Then we don't slip, Grace said, voice firm. We've been doing this for 6 months, Nolan. We're good at this. Are we? He asked, his voice low, but intense. Because the line between pretending and reality, it's not so clear for me anymore. The words landed like a stone dropped in the still water. I think your mother was right, he continued. We do look at each other differently. Grace felt the walls she'd built so carefully begin to tremble. What are you saying? She asked, barely above a whisper. I'm saying. Nolan stepped closer, searching her face. That Meridian wasn't just about business. That I've been making decisions lately, not because they're profitable, but because I think about what you would value. He paused. The moment cracked open between them. I'm saying, he continued, voice rougher now, that somewhere between hating each other and pretending to love each other, I've started to actually don't, Grace cut in, lifting a hand. Her voice trembled. This isn't part of the deal. To hell with the deal, Nolan said fiercely. I'm done pretending I'm just pretending. The paradox of his words hung between them raw, real, undeniable. Grace stood frozen, unsure what to do with this truth one neither of them had planned for, but both now had to face. It's just proximity, Grace said, her voice softer than usual. Familiarity. It creates the illusion of connection. Is that what you really believe? Nolan asked, stepping toward her. His tone was gentle, but unrelenting. Because I don't. He stopped inches from her. I think you're scared, he continued. Not of me, but of the possibility that your perfectly organized worldview might need revising. That maybe I'm not the villain in your narrative anymore. Grace crossed her arms, retreating a step. Or maybe you're just saying what you think I need to hear to protect your company. Nolan gave a dry, humorless laugh. If I were still playing that game, I'd stick to the script. Tell you this is strictly business. Safe. Convenient. But that's not what I'm doing, is it? Then why change the rules now? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. Because Blackstone isn't just targeting Carter and Rowe, Nolan said. They're making quiet moves toward Maddox equity too. Grace went still. That's not possible, she whispered. My grandfather's provisions protect the company, unless our marriage is deemed a fraud, Nolan said, voice low. If that happens, your shares revert to your uncle. And according to my mother, he's already talking to Blackstone. Grace swallowed. She didn't need to ask how her uncle's financial situation might make that temptation irresistible. So we're both exposed, she said finally. All the more reason to stick to the original plan. Or, Nolan said, stepping closer again, all the more reason to make it real, so real, no investigation could ever discredit it. She stared at him, searching his face for traces of manipulation, of the calculating man she once thought she knew. But all she saw was quiet sincerity. I can't just flip a switch, she said softly. This isn't just a strategy. It's our lives, our names. It's too important to confuse with emotions that could be circumstantial. Then let me prove to you it's not, Nolan replied. Come with me to the board meeting tomorrow, not as my contractual wife. Come as my partner. Fully. Officially. Her brow furrowed. What are you suggesting? A real merger, he said, the corner of his mouth lifting. Carter Maddox Investments, a firm that marries profit and principle. Just like our grandfathers imagined before they let pride and differences split them apart. Grace's mind shifted into analysis mode. The board would never approve that kind of restructuring. They would, Nolan said, if the alternative is a hostile dismantling by Blackstone. And if we combine our controlling shares, we can push it through. You're talking about completely redefining your company, she said. Your legacy. Everything you've built. Maybe it's time for something new, Nolan replied. A legacy worth sharing, not just with a business partner, but with you. The room went quiet. The proposal hung in the air, heavier than any document ever drafted. A business plan and a confession all at once. I need time, Grace said finally. We don't have time, Nolan replied gently. The board meets at 9 tomorrow. Then I need tonight, she said. No more conversation until morning. Nolan nodded, sensing she needed space, not just to think, but to feel. I'll be in my office, he said. If you have questions, financial, strategic, personal, anything. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. Nolan, he turned back. This isn't just about saving the companies, is it? For a man known for his eloquence, Nolan Carter suddenly had no words. No, he said quietly. It hasn't been for a while now. With that, he walked away, leaving Grace alone. With the numbers, with the risks, and with something far more daunting. Grace had always turned to data in moments of emotional chaos. Spreadsheets, market projections, precedent cases comforting things. Predictable, rational. But tonight, between the neat columns and polished analytics, her mind kept drifting elsewhere. To how Nolan had quietly joined a local community garden initiative. To how he now listened, truly listened, when she spoke about sustainability, ethics, and long-term impact. To the way he brought coffee to her bedside when she worked too late. To the debates that once left her exhausted, but now left her energized. Could a man really change this much in 6 months? Or had he simply revealed who he had always been buried under legacy, expectation, and boardroom armor? Midnight. Grace stood silently in the doorway of his office. The light was dim, soft gold from a desk lamp. Nolan sat surrounded by documents, his laptop casting faint shadows across his tired face. You should get some sleep, she said gently. He looked up. There was fatigue in his eyes, but also clarity. Big day tomorrow, she added. Just running the numbers again, he said. Making sure the proposal is airtight. Is it? He nodded. It works, financially, ethically, stronger than either company alone. Grace walked over, perching on the edge of his desk. Her voice was quieter now. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, about not pretending to pretend anymore. She exhaled slowly. I still don't know what's real and what's just circumstance. But I do know this. I respect who you're becoming. A man who questions what he used to accept, who considers more than profit, who's brave enough to rewrite his legacy. Nolan reached for her hand, not as part of a performance, but because he needed to. And I respect the woman who challenged me to do it, he said softly, who never once compromised her values, who took our grandfather's manipulation and turned it into something possibly meaningful. She laced her fingers through his. So tomorrow, she said, we stand together as business partners. Absolutely, Nolan replied. And the rest? One step at a time, Grace said with a faint smile. We still have 2.5 years left in our arrangement. Plenty of time to figure out what this really is. And if it turns out to be real? Nolan asked, his voice low. Grace tilted her head. Then maybe our grandfathers weren't just meddling old men. Maybe they were unexpectedly wise. Nolan stood, still holding her hand. He looked at her differently now, open, present, no longer guarded. For what it's worth, he said, I think they'd be proud to see us standing together. Against Blackstone, against anything that threatens what our families built. Grace repeated the word softly, like it was new in her mouth. Together. Stranger things have happened, Nolan said, a smile tugging at the corner of his lips, like a self-important millionaire falling for the woman who once publicly destroyed him. I never said anything about falling, she teased, but her eyes told another story. You didn't have to, he replied gently, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. There was no audience, no camera flash, no investors watching. So when she leaned in and kissed him, really kissed him, it wasn't for show. It was tentative at first, then certain, as if their bodies had known something their minds were only now catching up to. When they finally broke apart, Nolan looked as breathless as she felt. Well, he murmured with a dazed smile. That should definitely convince the board. Grace laughed, really laughed. The sound was soft, surprised, a little disbelieving, and entirely sincere. Still thinking like a strategist, she said. Not always, Nolan whispered, drawing her closer. Sometimes. I'm just a man who got lucky with an arranged marriage. We haven't won yet, Grace reminded him as they stepped out into the pale morning light. Neither has Blackstone, Nolan replied, his voice steadier than it had been in months. And we're stronger now, especially together. As dawn broke over Brooklyn, they sat side by side at the kitchen table, finalizing two mergers at once, one of companies, the other of lives. The line between strategy and sincerity had long since blurred. Now it simply didn't matter. By the time they arrived at Carter and Row for the emergency board meeting, they walked in not just as a couple, but as a unified force, still fiercely independent, still challenging each other, but now with a shared purpose. The room quieted the moment they entered. It was Nolan who opened with numbers, calmly laying out the financial architecture of the proposed merger. But it was Grace who brought the room to life, painting a vision of a company that could do more than grow profits. A company that could lead with conscience, shape markets with integrity, and redefine what success meant. When questions came, they answered in tandem, passing the conversation like a rhythm between musicians who knew each other's tempo instinctively. No rehearsed script, just trust, just truth. Their differences, once weapons, had become strength. When the Blackstone representatives finally entered, prepared to feast on a fractured firm, they found instead a wall of unity. The board, already swayed, had little appetite for outside vultures. I believe this concludes today's meeting, Nolan said, with a trace of a smile. Blackstone left empty-handed. As the boardroom emptied, Margaret Carter approached quietly. She looked between her son and the woman who had once been his fiercest critic and was now his fiercest ally. Your grandfather would be surprised, she said. Surprised? Grace asked. Or proud? Margaret smiled. Both. Though I suspect he always hoped the second would make the first possible. As she walked away, Nolan turned to Grace, his tone lighter. So, Mrs. Carter? Or should I be saying Miss Maddox Carter now? Grace raised an eyebrow. Depends. Are we talking about business or breakfast plans? Well, Mrs. Maddox Carter, he said, drawing her gently toward him in the now empty boardroom. What's next on our never-expected agenda? She grinned. A company to rebuild, a marriage to redefine, and about 2.5 years to decide whether our grandfathers were manipulative masterminds or just lucky matchmakers. And if I already know the answer, Nolan asked. Then, Mr. Carter, Grace whispered, you're ahead of schedule. But I've always admired your efficiency. Their kiss this time held no pretense, no performance, only presence. On the wall behind them, two portraits seemed to watch in silence, Hamilton Carter and James Maddox, old friends whose falling out had somehow sparked the most unlikely of reconciliations. Sometimes the longest journeys don't just lead us home. Sometimes they lead us to the person who feels like home, even when the road was charted by someone else, even when the destination had been arranged long before the travelers were ready to arrive. Thank you for walking this journey with us. If this story has made you pause, reflect, or simply feel a little less alone in your own path, it's done its job. We hope it reminded you that even in the most unlikely circumstances, healing is possible. That connection can grow from conflict. That sometimes The heart takes the longest route to arrive, but it arrives. Thank you for listening. Thank you for feeling. And above all, thank you for believing in stories that don't need to be perfect, just real. With love, Shining Stories.